Alrighty, so I'm here with Larry Sunderland. Larry, would you call yourself a veteran of the US soccer scene?
Yeah, I guess I would be. I guess I would be a veteran.
In the best
By
possible way,
virtue,
right?
yeah, by virtue of my age, I think.
No, I don't think it's just virtue by age. I think it's virtue by expertise. I've heard nothing but positive things. I've saying to you before, people that have been contributing to some of the stuff we've been doing have spoken positively about you. So yeah, I'm excited for this session. Yeah, we're just going to chat about your background, your experience, and youth soccer and development, and the US soccer scene more broadly, I guess, as well. The World Cup's coming very soon. Lots of investment coming into US soccer, left, right, and center, which is great for the game. It's for every level, I think. And yeah, it'd be good to kind of get your take on the evolution of soccer over the past 10, 20, 30 years, however far back you want to go, and where you maybe see it going. So, Larry, tell me about your journey first. What's your journey? I guess coaching, obviously, and player development's a massive part of that. But tell me about your journey in football more broadly, and obviously what's led to the success you've had in your career.
Yeah, well, I think first, thanks for having me on, Andy. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Look, my journey started, I grew up in the game. I was fortunate that my dad was involved in the game and kind of one of the pioneers here in the States. Um, but I think this path of player development for me started after my playing days. I always knew I wanted to teach to get into coaching. Um, and I think what it's always been for me, it's always been about trying to create a better environment for the players.
Larry, tell me about your journey in soccer so far.
Well, I think my 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 coaching journey and my management leadership journey kind of is all based around the same idea of creating a better environment for the players. And later on in my career now about creating a better environment, not only for the players, but also for staff. Um, I think it's been really interesting for me having been a part of three different MLS clubs. That when I finished my playing career in Chicago, I jumped right into coaching. And this evolution as a coach for me, when I first started, the environment I created for the players was very much dictated, I think, by my own ego, right? As a player, everything you do is based on outcome, unfortunately, right? And it's about the wins and the losses. So my initial days in my coaching journey were kind of based on outcomes, right? And it was all about winning. That's how I judged if I was doing a good job or not. And that created a different kind of environment around the field, right? That created a really high pressure environment, which can be good at sometimes, but it was very much based on outcomes, which wasn't really good for the players as we're trying to develop them over long term. So I had to kind of adjust that and create a different environment for my players, and that came as I became more educated in coaching, perhaps more worldly in coaching. But as I began to coach more and more and kind of move up the ranks in coaching, my journey kind of led me now into more of management leadership roles, right? Because you typically in player development, you're coaching, and then you kind of move a little bit away from the field as you get older into more management and leadership. And I tried to take the same theory of creating a better environment for my players into my leadership and management. And I've really used that moving from Chicago to Portland, a completely different area of the country. You have to remember, the United States is a continent, and you know, and each area of the country has different culture to deal with. So I was really intrigued to move all the way out to Portland, where I knew no one, and to see if my management style, my leadership style could be successful out there. So that was a great challenge for me. And it helped me to learn how, again, to coach a different type of player than the player I was having in Chicago, and to manage a different type of staff than I was managing in Chicago. Um, which then led me to an opportunity in Cincinnati to try to build from scratch again, like I had done in Chicago, with a brand new MLS club, um, with a world of opportunity. And again, where I really didn't know anyone, where I was coming in to challenge myself, challenge my theories on coaching and leadership, and try to put something new in place. So I think, my journey has always been based around like trying to create better environments.
Yeah, great. And Larry, take me back to you mentioned a word that I always find interested in coaching about the ego, right? And the coach's ego. Take me back to when I guess take me back to where the time when you felt like that was driving your ambition, perhaps more so than it might be now in terms of obviously you've developed your approach and probably built cultures not so based around that. But do you see the ego driving a lot of relatively young coaches, and how do you help them understand the that balance between winning and player development? Because that's a really big thing around the world, right? Is that
Yeah.
winning at all costs, and then player development, playing that kind of player-centric environment that generally fosters long-term development, right? How do you build that? How do you mentor young coaches who maybe you see some of yourself in them, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Look, ego is not a negative, right? Ego is very important to ambition, to drive, um, to continued excellence, right? And performance. Egos are very much a part of that. But I think you can't be driven by that. I think you need to. I talk to my staff about it all the time about having a quiet ego, right? And the ability to manage the ego in such a way that it doesn't block you and it doesn't cause you to be biased in various ways, right? Um, so so I saw ego in my own coaching when I was a younger coach. Um, I was, and again, don't get me wrong. I think there's absolutely a time to joystick players. Absolutely. Joysticking is something that you need to have in your coaching toolbox. However, I was overcome with joysticking. I was playing every action on the field, um, and I created an environment that was more likely for the players, fear based, right? And and that can certainly drive success. A fear-based environment can drive success. It has for many, many years, right? And fear is absolutely again is another link to ego. It's another driving force that, when used properly, can be really it can aid to successful development, right? But when it is the driving force, that's a problem. And I think back in those days, I think the success of the team was solely based on winning, and my personal identity was wrapped up in winning. So I really had to step back at some point and try to understand where theory and practice, where the professor on the side of the field and where the leader on the field can kind of come together to create an environment that's much more conducive to long-term player development.
How challenging is that? How challenging did you find that evolution from being a coach who was driven primarily by winning and like you said, maybe a bit too much ego or joysticking as you mentioned? What was that evolution like? Was that over the first few years of your career, or is it still evolving now? How do you see it?
Oh, I think it's certainly still evolving. But from the coaching standpoint, on the field, I think just like a player, every coach is an individual. So every coach is going to deal with ego and fear in different ways. For me, it was, I'll tell you a story. It's probably quite embarrassing. But I was coaching. I was coaching. This was back in the old PDL days, where we were trying to develop this integrated program at the Chicago Fire, right? And the PDL was in between the academy and the first team. And in those days, it was kind of a summer league, professional development league. And I was coaching a team, and I was very, at that point, I was very much, ego driven. And that was how I coached. And I'll make it brief. I got thrown out of the game because I was upset with some calls, whatever, right? So I lost my composure on the sideline, got thrown out of the game, and I had to sit off the field, right? And and I remember being outside the fence, off the field, almost climbing the fence, kind of yelling instructions. And then when the game ended, I kind of walked back on the field, and I had one of my sons, who was probably 7 years old at the time, came running across the field crying because he thought I had gotten arrested. He thought the referee had arrested me and was going to take me away from the field, right? So it was kind of a moment, that a pretty stark moment to me. And I was like, wow, what am I doing here? And I'm not behaving right on the field. I don't think I'm doing the right thing for my players. And then I have one of my sons even, watching this and probably taking the wrong message from it. So that was kind of just a moment of kind of reflection that I had that was maybe at the genesis of some of the transformation I had in coaching.
And would you say that from a wider context? And I'm not sure if we'll come back to it later, but the US mentality, which I think is a great one, which is a kind of a very winning. So
Mm,
they want to win. The US mentality, the average US person wants to win, right, in sport, and
yes.
it goes to parents, coaches. I think that's a great thing to have, and the US win at most things. Have you seen that evolve over time from a US soccer perspective in terms of maybe not necessarily naming clubs, but have you seen over the past 20 years or so that evolved naturally across the entire soccer space, like alongside your own evolution, or are there still some clubs or coaches that you might think are still stuck doing things maybe in a different way?
Well, I think it's such a broad spectrum, and the states are so massive, and then the various levels within the states of youth soccer and what I would call professional player development and whatnot. It's such a wide scope. I'd say absolutely, yeah. There's no question. There are many coaches probably still stuck in this ego um, cycle, let's say. Um, but look again. I'll go back to what I said before. It's not about getting rid of the ego. It's not about getting rid of the fear. It's about managing it in some sort of productive way and authentically, right? I want to win, right? And every player I work with understands I want to win. But I think I've developed more strategies and more tools that I can use it more. I can use those strategies and those tools more effectively to better help my player. Now, look, there's controversy around it, though, isn't there? Because you touched on the fact that the kind of the American way was always we fought, right? And you go back years to national teams, we'd fight, okay? And there's some criticism that maybe we have lost that a little bit. So I think this is something that's continually evolving. It ebbs and it flows. I think every environment is going to be a little bit different. Every head coach is going to develop a little bit of a different environment, and there's going to be sometimes where more fight is conducive, and sometimes maybe where a more intellectual approach to things is going to be more conducive to success. Whatever success is, right? I think there has to be a lot of different tools used and a lot of different strategies used to find high performance.
And how linked to that point, how do you and this example is obviously Cincinnati and Portland and Chicago, but how do you get alignment with your team, your staff who are obviously coaching different levels as well as in the first team as well, and that kind of how do you align and have an integrated approach so that there's an identity behind that. So, I don't know what FC Cincinnati's style of play is or philosophy might
Mm.
be, but how do you link that in your role specifically to make sure that there is that flow of development, but there's also like there's an identity behind it all, which is unique to the club. Is that something you find easy, hard? What's that look like for you right now or in your career?
Um, I wrote a paper on this for my sporting directorship masters. Alignment. Wow, alignment is this this mythical word, right? That's thrown out there in football and soccer player development. Um, I have yet to put my finger on it, right? Because I think that those goalposts are always moving. So it's reasonably easy in my mind to align aspects of player development. Um, but oftentimes, if you're talking about aligning academy, second team, first team, it's very, very difficult, right? Because the missions are somewhat different. In some cases, the missions are vastly different. So how do you align those missions so that everybody's on the same page with it, right? So when we talk about data and we talk about KPIs, you know, how do you align KPIs from the academy with KPIs at the first team when really the biggest KPI at the first team is winning trophies, right? And you know, oftentimes, I think there's a lot more to success at the academy level, but oftentimes a very simple KPI in the academy space is how many players are you moving to the first team? Well, those missions can be in direct contrast, right? Because playing young players often takes a lot of courage. And if you're if you're judging success at the first team level by trophies, it's often hard to blend those two or align those two missions. So I think that idea is always evolving, right? Having been at three different places now, or three different MLS academies, and studying alignment, in Europe, in South America, is very tricky. There are very, very few romantic examples of pure alignment like you had probably back in the heyday of Barcelona, right?
Mhm.
And you can see Barcelona's returning to that a little bit, where it's almost bottom up driven, where the academy is almost driving the, whether you want to call it style or methodology or game model of the first team. So look, to keep it short and simple, I think the idea of alignment is very, very elusive. It's easy enough to align certain aspects of it, but I think it's very, very difficult to get true alignment. And it is, like all things player development related, it's cooking with a crock pot and not a microwave. So I think it's going to take, to get true alignment takes a long time.
Do you see that? Do you see that improving? It's like, maybe that's the wrong word. Obviously, the MLS is moving to a European season, right? In terms of
Yeah.
the start and finish, and for commercial benefit potentially, and obviously player transfers and transfer windows make sense. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure to win trophies at the the first team. Do you see that going in a positive way in your mind, not just for Cincinnati, but for any MLS club, I guess, in terms of players being able to get to the first team? There's a big debate in Europe. I think we see, an a term I don't like very much. It's a conveyor belt of talent, right? And you see
Mhm.
it at the top level academies in the English Premier League, and the majority of the time, the players who are fantastic players in academy for 10, 15 years, typically in the UK, they don't make it to the first team, but they might make it as a footballer, which is almost the goal, right? Is that the goal how you see it at Cincinnati? Are you trying to make these players get to, pro level, wherever that might be, high college level, or is the expectation a bit more fluid than that? And is that going to change, do you think, as the MLS naturally evolves and kind of, over the next few years?
Yeah, I think yeah, it's fluid. I definitely feel that it's going to evolve. It is evolving. Um, the you know, you take a top down look, and of course, from the top down, we're making significant investments in player development, and from the top down, we're looking at the returns on those investments, and those are financial returns. So that means moving players to the first team. That means continuing to develop those young players at the first team level and moving them on, right, for some kind of revenue. Um,
Mhm.
that's one aspect of player development, but we also, as developers of people, we also know that the percentage of players that go on to play professional football in the big scale of things, the big scope of things, is very, very small. So while that may be a very important outcome, right, that we develop pros, there has to be more to it. There has to be more to it. So I think, one of the benefits, I think that there maybe are some negatives to it, but one of the benefits that we have in the United States is that we have traditionally developed our athletes through the schooling system as well, right? So there is in most of the sports in this country this idea that you're going to be a teenager playing your sport, you're good enough to get some kind of college scholarship, you get a degree, and if you're fortunate to be one of the few, you go on to play pro sports in the U.S. the average age of an NFL rookie is 22. The average age of a Major League Baseball rookie is 25. We're trying to do something much different here in soccer, right? For better or worse, the marketplace is much younger. So there's a lot more pressure to develop a player at 16, 17, 18, rightly or wrongly. So there's going to be there very few that make it, but there has to be something for those that don't, right? And I think we do have a system in the United States that maybe provides for those players, whether it's college educations, and I think you do have to take some pride in developing the person beyond just the footballer. So I think that has always been here. Now, this idea of return on investment is becoming more and more important. This is, I'd say, 14 years where we've had real player development in the US, where there's been real investment from MLS ownership in player development. There has to be a return on this. Now, there's return on moving a player to the first team. There's replacement value, what have you, right? There's different mechanisms through our salary cap and whatnot that are all benefits to moving players to the first team. Now we need to find more mechanisms for moving players on and sell-ons and sales and whatnot. And I think we're just kind of scratching the surface of that in the US. Again, I go back to that idea of player development as a crock pot. And we really, in the big scale of things, we haven't been doing it that long. We're finding more success now. I think we need to open more avenues to Europe with partnerships to moving some of our players through the system that maybe aren't ready for our first team, maybe are a different style, but we can move them somewhere else. We're beginning to see this movement intra-league, where we're moving players from our academy to other clubs. We're getting players from other academies to come to our club that maybe fit what we're doing better. But I do think we need to become more global in this aspect. And I think that's a bit of what's behind the change in schedule, just to bring us in line with the rest of the world. That will help us to access more player movement and help our player development, I believe.
Just interesting points. Just kind of pulling on almost 2 points you just said. You mentioned about the age of soccer players and the development for like rookies in different sports, more traditional American sports, I guess, right? Whereas, a rookie at least in the US, the theory goes, when, the age is only one factor. When you're ready to play in the first team, you're ready to play, and that can be potentially quite young for a soccer player. In Europe, you typically see at the top academies, U6, U7, U8, kind of competing at a high level. I was speaking to Jose, who's directing the academy over at Orlando City right now, and he was talking about one of the challenges of doing that. He's Spanish, he's from Spain, but he lives in the US for a long time. He said one of the challenges he thinks that Orlando City and Florida or the MLS in general, in terms of MLS clubs, would have is the competition level is not there. Right, so you could have high level of coaching, and the coaching level is getting higher and higher every year here, which is great, and I agree with that. But the competition to be able to compete, so for example, in England, you would have Chelsea Football Club, who have got a U7 team, and they can then go and compete 20 minutes down the road with other U7 teams, other clubs. It's easy, in terms of logistics, whereas the US has got a geographical problem. Do you ever see at some stage kind of thinking, and from the second point about kind of aligning with sort of maybe some more European approaches or commercial benefits, do you see academies in the MLS bringing that age down lower and being able to have a structure where maybe you can compete at a higher level? Because I think that's one thing I often get asked, like, I live here in the US now, and people say, like, when are the US going to win the World Cup? And I said it's a very difficult, it's not a simple question. It's a simple question to ask, not a simple question to answer, right? And I say it starts with the foundation. It's not about Pochettino, right? And I say one of the points is that I think that the US is every other country in South America, Europe, who are starting their players at younger age have got a massive head start on US athletes. The athletes in the US are always going to be very strong, like physically. That's never going to be an issue. But if they've got 3 or 4 years of high level technical training under their belt compared to the US, they're always at a disadvantage. And that feels like a great gap for me.
Yeah.
Just simply to say if England, for example, were to compete with the US tomorrow, like forget about the tradition behind the sports, for example, the US can compete physically, no doubt, but technically maybe not so much. And maybe that's just because they haven't had high level training for so long. But is that something you see happening in the future? And how difficult would it be to implement if it was going to happen? The younger age groups and that high level training.
First off, thank you. Because I've been a proponent of going younger for a long time. When I had Chicago, we went down to under 10. We had the youngest academy in MLS. Um, I think it's I think it's very, very important that we start younger. I really do. I spent quite a bit of time at Bilbao, and when I would speak, I'd go watch an under 8 team train, and then I'd go watch the second team. And I would ask the academy director, how many of those under 8s that I'm watching there do you expect to be on the second team at one point? And he threw out a number like 75 to 80%. And I was like, wow,
Yeah.
really? And he said, yeah, we view the player like an orange, and we squeeze the orange, and we squeeze the orange, and we squeeze. Okay, Bilbao has certain constraints that they have because of
Yeah.
the players they will use in their first team. But I believe it's very important, and will we see MLS academies go that young? Some of the issues that we have tremendous issues with our competitive platforms. A lot of people tend to focus on the pay to play issue when they talk about the US, but I
Mhm.
think they also neglect the competitive platforms. We have more acronyms for leagues around the United States than I've seen anywhere in the world, right? And we don't know which acronym is better because every acronym is saying it's the best competitive platform. And so and don't forget, each of those acronyms is a business. So it's pay to play from clubs, but it's also pay to play from leagues. So that's a very tricky thing there. But I also think there are MLS. We forget how MLS began and why MLS began and why MLS has the business model that it has, right? We've had so many professional soccer leagues in this country that folded after 2, 3, 5 years, right? That there needed to be a different business model. And that was kind of the genesis of MLS, right? To have this single entity, and it struggled in the early years, and now it's strong and it's not going anywhere, and it's actually and kind of an incredible business model, right? But one of the things it does is we don't we compete on the player development level in some ways with every youth club in our market, even though we shouldn't. There should be an attitude of let's push it, like in Bilbao. I'm so proud to push every player from my youth club to Bilbao. It's not quite that simple in the United States, right? Because every club is a business, every league is a business. So I think sometimes in our desire to be somewhat neutral, we have we have maybe compromised some best practices in player development, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that I was going to ask you about pay to play as well, and it's 2 of my daughters are in a small community club near where I live in Tampa, doing really well. My one of them's playing up a couple of year groups, and she's tiny, but she's quite a talented little girl. But it's interesting because you have tryouts at community clubs, right? And I see them as having been in football for 20 years myself. I see them as tryouts for the club. I'm trying you out as well as my children trying out, right?
Yeah.
But from a very basic perspective, there's not enough girls in this example to be able to play. And I'd say this is another issue, and pay to play maybe is part of that, but the accessibility, I guess generationally as well, there's not enough parents who I stand on the sidelines with as a fellow parent who are from a soccer background as well. So like how do we get more children just playing? Like again, it's a big question, but how do we get that? Or do you just see that naturally evolving? The past 20 years has been incredible, the growth of soccer. But there's so much competition for other sports and from generational nuances. And, if you've got your dad who was into American football, my son or my daughter will be into American football too. How do you change that so soccer can benefit? Or is that just something that has to naturally evolve generationally?
I think, yeah, I think there's absolutely a generational aspect to it, no question. Um, I think, look, there could be more leadership um, from US Soccer, from MLS. I know, personally here in Cincinnati, we're trying to do a lot more in the grassroots level, right? We're trying to do more regional programming. We're trying to do more regional coaching with our affiliate and partner groups. We're building, small fields, mini fields, everywhere we can. Um, I think those things can happen, but it is such a long-term process. Like, for instance, I can remember many years ago, 25 years ago, when I started to regularly visit Spain and football, right? And women's football in Spain, 25 years ago, there just wasn't much there,
Hmm.
right? It was generational. Dad's sons played football,
Yeah.
daughters didn't. You know, Now it's completely accepted. Dads want their daughters to play football just as much as they want their sons to play football. And you
Yeah.
look at the rapid growth of women's football in Spain, just because there was a generational mind shift there, right? Where I believe where dads were like, oh yes, women can play this game as well, and it's important for my daughters to be playing this, et cetera, et cetera. And you just saw the growth. And again, the culture drove the rapid ascent of the Spanish women's national teams, right? And the Spanish club teams are so much better today than just 5 years ago,
Mm.
you know? So how do we influence that generational change? I think we do it by being visible, but I also think we do it by there seems to always be like a key point in evolution, right? The 94 World Cup was the genesis of MLS. You know, in 2007, US started the Development Academy, which I think was the genesis of real player development in the US. The MLS academies were formed in 2007. Free, right? Investments in player development. What is next summer's World Cup going to mean for the US, Canada, and Mexico? Is that going to be a turning point where maybe there's some generational shift where, the amount of professional athletes coming out of Cincinnati has vastly outnumbers in Major League Baseball and NFL than soccer. Soccer's, over the years we've had a small handful, but we've had a lot of NFL and a lot of Major League Baseball players. So can 2026 be a catalyst or a turning point where, maybe we start to see more of these traditional football or baseball families push their kids towards soccer? I don't know, but I think you got to keep throwing things out there and then be ready for when that next shoe drops. So
Mm.
that, you're there.
How much does this staying on that point, how much does the success do you think of the US national team next summer, um, how much of an impact is that going to be? And I speak as an Englishman who has three daughters. So, and I often get asked, would you like to have a son so you can, you love football, you have a son? And I'm always shocked by the comment. I'm always like, well, but what's that got to do with playing soccer? Like the gender, right? Because maybe my generation now is very much like doesn't make a difference, right? And my girls will play soccer if they like it or not, and they do like it at the moment. But in terms of a big catalyst, and you mentioned it there, a big catalyst for a jump in popularity quite recently for the English national team was the Lionesses in England winning the Euros competition,
Yeah,
right? Big competition, and obviously now them and Spain are kind of neck and neck as kind of the
yeah.
two big teams. So that was a big thing, right, for women's football in the UK as well as a bunch of other factors too, a lot of investment too, of course. But how much does the success of the US men's team next year how much is that going to be a catalyst for like a really big wave of growth? If the US fall flat, that's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say. If it falls flat, is that going to be potentially detrimental to the sport? Because the US have had some mixed results right now. The men's team have anyway.
Yeah, correct. I look, touch wood. I hope we make a good run because obviously, then the fan base just grows. People that normally aren't exposed to football will see it everywhere. And it could have that could affect generational change, no doubt. The success of the women's national team over many years has had generational change with women's soccer in the US.
Yeah.
Like the Lionesses did in England. Yeah, falling flat, boy. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think there's I think there's enough momentum with MLS um, and 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 youth soccer, women's and men's soccer in the US. There's enough traction there that it will keep rolling. I hope. You saw like recently some of the men's national team games were poorly attended, what have you, right? But that hasn't affected MLS. Um, so uh, first, I hope we have a great World Cup. I hope we make a good run at it. Um, and I'm hopeful that if it didn't go well for us, that there's enough traction. There are enough soccer, football fans in the United States now, people that are interested in it, that that wave would carry on throughout the rest of the World Cup. And we will walk away looking at, 2026 like we did 94 with some, great new investment, great new ideas, and positive change. I hope it comes regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, and talking on the investment, and I'm sure you've been following it a little bit as well. I have been quite recently. The USL appears to be having quite a significant amount of investment coming into it over the next few years, which, from a player development perspective, I find very interesting. I mean, obviously, a lot of the talk is around USL, MLS, and the different structures, promotion, relegation, and all that stuff is very interesting. But for me, from a player development and player pathway perspective, I was very excited because I felt that this is going to be, obviously it's going to take a little while to get off the ground. There needs to be some patience, but it could be great. It could be great for everyone involved in soccer because it's going to allow more opportunities, more high level competitive play more regularly, which is almost going back to the point we mentioned earlier, Larry, kind of that playing at a younger age group. If that was to ever happen, it feels like if there was USL clubs who are able to compete with MLS clubs, fairly well, then you'd have potential for you to bring that player development age younger. And then the pathway, if a child wasn't necessarily perfectly suited to Cincinnati, they could perhaps go to a competitor USL club nearby in the same state. Whereas right now you haven't necessarily got that competition. Depends on what state you're in. Do you see the USL and that growth in that part of the soccer scene here as a good thing for player development?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's massive. It's massive for player development. We absolutely do not have enough pathways to professional football. Whether first, second, third division, whatever it is, there are not
Yeah.
enough pathways developed in this country to satisfy the amount of talent or potential talent that is out there in the US. I think that is a for us to compete internationally at a better level consistently. I think that is one of the places where we are limited. We don't have uh, we just don't have enough pathways for players that develop at different rates. Let's say, again, we go back to this idea of a football player is, at 16, 17, you got to make a decision, but an NFL player, you're not making a decision until 22, and
Yeah.
a Major League Baseball player, you're not making a decision until 25. So probably those decisions are much better. With more and various pathways to professional football in the United States, that can only make us better. Um, and if you take a microcosm, what we do in the player development space in an academy is, yeah, we try to identify and develop the best talent, but it's not just developing the top talent, it's developing the scaffold underneath that pushes that top talent up. So if we have a robust second, third division, robust player development in the second, third divisions, that's just going to make the scaffold push the top talent, to a higher level. And I think that helps, the rising tide lifts all boats. I really think that's true.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment. And someone I spoke to recently and well regarded in the US soccer space, his opinion was that he felt that the level of coaching in the US has significantly developed and it's got better and better and better. And that has naturally then led to the average American soccer player being better than
Mm.
it was 10, 15 years ago. And he sees that consistently across the MLS in this example. What he
Sure.
said he was concerned about, or I won't paraphrase exactly what he said, but he didn't feel like perhaps there was any stars evolving as much as we would like to see them. And when we say stars, I guess we're talking about the Pulisic's and the kind of level, the Clint Dempsey's perhaps kind of going back to some players who have really made it, at the very, very highest level. And typically that is exporting to Europe and playing in the top leagues there. Do you share that opinion, or do you see top level talent, kind of going back to your point earlier, do you see top level talent and those potential stars coming through the academies, or is there something that's stunting that growth? How do you see it? And not just in Cincinnati, I guess just broadly in
Yeah.
your viewpoint.
I mean, I could see where, first, I 100% agree that the multitude of soccer players around the country have improved vastly, right? Which is a good thing, again, because that, in theory anyway, the improvement of that scaffold should make the top level much better. I think it's very difficult. It's difficult to compare one generation of soccer player to another generation of soccer player to another generation of soccer player, right? The, the Clint Dempseys of the world that came out of US soccer and went overseas, Christians that went overseas, they're individuals, right? And every player's individual pathway will be different. I think the level of play in the MLS is higher now than it was when they were, say, 18 and on that cusp.
Yeah.
I think the level of play is higher. So I think the level of play of, conversely, I think the level of play of, young American players coming into the league is probably higher, right? It would only make sense if the league is getting better. The league is bringing in more players. They're bringing in South American, the U22 initiative, bringing in some of the best 22s. We're bringing in European players now in their prime, right? I think the American player that's bubbling up into first teams is overall better. And you still have those that are making the jump to Europe for whatever reason. So I think it's really hard to necessarily have a real concrete answer to that, if that makes sense.
Mm.
It's like, was Pele the best, or Maradona, or Messi? I think those are very difficult things because the times are different. Maybe Christian comes through the system now, and he comes through Inter Miami's academy, and he stays at Miami. Now, he wouldn't be getting maybe the amount of publicity because he's at Milan, and but he's still Christian. So it's hard to say. I think it's a difficult one.
Yeah, no, I hear that. Let's talk. I'm conscious of our time. Like, I could talk to you about some of these things all day, but I'm conscious of your time. Let's talk a bit about the sort of future and how you see things evolving in MLS academies. Let's start there. Obviously, that's what you're heavily involved with. Um, where do you see MLS academies going over the next 10 years? Where do you see it evolving? Where do obviously the legacy from the World Cup, is that going to change anything, or maybe it won't? What does an MLS academy look like in 5, 10 years in your mind? Or is it still the same?
Yeah, there is I guess I see, I, I'll put it this way. If there's a commitment to player development being a crock pot, I go back to using that kind of analogy. If there's a commitment to player development being a crock pot, I think the future of MLS player development is very, very bright. If the future of player development is based on being a microwave, I think it's going to change and become more limited. I don't know what the answer to that is. I hope, like I said before, I hope we build out more robust, deeper academies that can really link to the community, that can be a focal point of pride for the soccer community in their area, with a great deal of pride of moving players there and players going back and forth and monitoring players and bringing players along at their own speed. I really hope that is what MLS becomes, and that is the direction that MLS goes, and that's the direction that USL goes, and we begin to really blanket the US with professional player development models that are accessible to all players, right? Financially accessible, socioeconomically accessible. I hope that's the case. There is a fear that if we take the microwavable player development approach, that and if MLS looks at shortcuts to player development, that perhaps you could see fewer MLS Academy teams, and you could see a greater reliance on the pay-to-play model in youth clubs to bubble up players like they perhaps did 15 years ago to a smaller MLS Academy that then kind of takes the cream off the top, doesn't really develop them, but picks the cream off the top and tries to, move them through that way, along with players from South America and elsewhere. I don't know. Those are two completely different ends of the spectrum. I would say we're probably somewhere in the middle right now. You're seeing with some MLS academies, like the Philadelphia Union, right, are finding great success after many, many years of significant investment. They significantly invested in their player development system. They significantly played young players, and they were okay with the crockpot approach. I think it took them 10 to 12 years before they sold their first player, but now it's beginning to percolate and it's working. And so I think we need to give clubs time to do that. And I think we will find success. I have no doubt we will find success. And I just hope there's that commitment to that long-term, deeper player development strategy than a shorter term microwavable model where maybe we have quick short-term success, but maybe it satisfies the ROI in the short term. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And you see it in Europe as well.
Yeah, that's a dilemma everywhere, right? That's a dilemma everywhere.
How much pressure are clubs under in the US in terms of ROI? I think I saw a graph or a stat some other day in terms of MLS clubs. There's not that many that are making profit right now. Some are breaking even, and the majority I think are still making losses. I think that can still be sustainable, to an extent, right? But there's going to be at some point a need for return on investment, and obviously, depending on who the owners are and the owner groups, that the need to win trophies is a real pressure on that. And then obviously with MLS moving to, I guess, the European seasonal calendar, do you see that becoming a potential hindrance for American soccer players, US-based soccer players, where maybe more players from overseas are being brought in to compete with US players who, let's say they're 17, 18, very bright future, but then also suddenly they've got to compete with a Brazilian guy at same age has been brought in, and we see it. And it was a thing in England for a long time where there was English players weren't being brought through. And I'm a diehard Manchester United fan for my sins,
Yeah.
and I take great pride in the fact that we have got longest standing record for having an academy player
Yeah.
playing in our squad for a long time. But it's getting mighty close right now to not happening. And Kobe Mainoo better stay with us, otherwise we're going to have a problem. But yeah, how much pressure are MLS clubs do you see under to win and to get that return on investment? And how much does that filter down to the academies to say, actually, you know what? Thanks for developing this, talented US athlete for the past 7 years, but we've got a new guy who we just brought in. Do you see that becoming a challenge for US players more and more, or no?
Yeah. I think I think this is evolution of the game everywhere, right?
Mm,
Um, you can take a microcosm of that and look at the college soccer system now, right? The 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 vast amounts of foreign players that are coming into the US collegiate system
mm,
now. I mean, you see, a lot of the top college soccer programs in the US now are the rosters are, more than half foreign players.
mm,
So that is definitely having a knock-on effect of players that are coming out of, the youth ranks in the US that years ago were like, oh, you're a scholarship player. Now, their player, they're a freshman coming in and like, okay, you're not going to have any money, but maybe you'll play your sophomore or junior year. You know, it
mm.
it definitely has affected the college ranks. Um, can you see an effect with the U22 initiative, um, and the proof of concept that we've had in MLS now of moving young South American players to the MLS and then moving them to Europe? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's a great stopping, ground for young South American talent to come to the US, acclimate, learn English maybe, and play well, and then move on to Europe, which makes their transition to Europe that much more potentially more successful, right? So that concept has been proven. So yeah, does that potentially block a young American player coming through the academy? Yeah, yeah. But this is not just a US problem. This is
Mm.
around the world. And I also think it's independent of each individual club philosophy, right? I mean, how many players go through Madrid's academy and end up on the first team?
Mm.
Now, they're being sold all over the world, right? So it's a different model, So this is where I think we need to make strides in probably being more adaptable to what's coming and creating more potential pathways. And that's I'll go back to, you know, by changing the calendar, we're connecting to Europe and South America. So how do we further connect? So we have those player pathways. Okay, so a player comes through Madrid's academy, is an absolutely fantastic player that would play in half of La Liga's first teams, but they won't get to Madrid's first team.
Mhm.
So they move them. They move them somewhere else in Spain. They move them somewhere else in Europe. It's very easy in Europe, right? It's very easy to monetize that player in Europe because there are so many different leagues and pathways. It's a lot more difficult here. Um, I I believe Europe is becoming much more open to American players. Each country's at a different place in that, I think, but they're becoming more open to American players. So I think we need to somehow figure out a way to begin to capitalize on that, because there is talent coming through the U.S. market, and I think unfortunately some of it kind of hits roadblocks for one reason or another here in the States, and and they're either unaware of the potential opportunity for them in Europe somewhere. Um, they're either unaware of it or for one reason or another, they don't have access to it.
Okay, final two questions for you, Larry. Give me what your greatest hope would be for US soccer over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And my second and final question is, what advice would you give to a young coach who is looking to, work in MLS academies, who's looking to really progress as a coach in the US? So two questions. Yeah, what's your hope for US soccer? And what advice would you give to a young rookie coach who's showing promise but needs a bit of advice from an experienced pro like yourself?
So over the next 15 years for US soccer, um, I just I hope we um, I hope we as a country embrace the game, continue to embrace the game. I think we're really embracing the game. You know, there are very few people that I bring out to a game that have had no experience with soccer that I bring out to a game that don't end up back and that
Yeah,
don't end up being really interested in liking it. It is a different atmosphere to every other U.S. sport, without a doubt. So I believe the fan base is there. I believe the fan base is going to continue to grow. I would like to see the professional leagues. Um, I hope they've found ways to work better together to provide more opportunity for the American player. So, in 15 years, MLS, USL, whatever may come up, are players moving amongst those systems, in a supportive way. Um, that would be a hope of mine. It would be a hope of mine that, MLS academies become deeper in their development systems, grow their development systems, grow their outreach, grow their connection to the community, to help grow this football culture that we're trying to develop in the U.S. I think MLS academies can be a catalyst to that. I think we just need to think a little bit more in that way. So I think, I hope in 15 years from now, this feels a lot more like soccer, football is entrenched in the U.S., that our players are moving through various pathways in the U.S. and regularly going to Europe, and you know, and maybe we're one of the top 5 leagues at that point, so there's a lot more movement happening. So I hope we see that. Um, Advice for young coaches, young leaders. Um, I guess from the coaching standpoint, um, don't lose sight of the long term, right? Because when you look at the short term, things can get in the way. Don't lose sight of the long term. Keep preaching that this is a process, right? And instill habits in your players that can move them forward on the field and off the field. I think that would be my advice to coaches. Um, my advice to like academy leaders, you know, focus on building staff with the right people, with good people, building staff, building culture, building environments that help people to continue to reach their potential. Um, and then I think to our leaders, our soccer leaders, to work on communicating, um, in a communicating a clear vision. You know, if I'm a soccer leader, if I'm at the top, communicate a clear vision. Where are we going? What are we doing? How are we getting there? I think that would be kind of my advice, um, going forward.
Nice. Thank you, Larry. Like I said, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I think I could have asked you another 100 questions.
Well,
But
this was a lot of fun, Andy.
yeah,
Same.
no, good.
I could sit here all day.
I'm glad. I mean, I could talk about football forever, and my wife always pulls me up on the need to not talk about football so much. But no, it's a pleasure speaking to someone who's just as passionate as I am about the game and player development and everything else that goes with it. So yeah, so many good insights, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, Larry.
Thanks for having me, Andy.